Okay.
Okay, and we're live.
Awesome.
Great. Okay, good evening. I would like to start this event by acknowledging that we are situated upon traditional territories. The territories include the Wendat, Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of Scugog, Hiawatha, Alderville First Nation, and the Métis Nation. They also recognize the enduring presence of Aboriginal peoples on this land. The work of the Scarborough Civic Action Network is about civic voice and inclusion, and it's important for us to remind ourselves of all the communities living here in Scarborough. Welcome to Right to Ride, an online community forum intended to look at the impact of COVID-19 on public transit with a focus on Scarborough. My name is Anna Kim, and I'm the coordinator of the Scarborough Civic Action Network, or better known as SCAN, and I will be the moderator for this evening's event. Very briefly, let me tell you about SCAN. SCAN is a nonpartisan network that aims to promote and support civic engagement that addresses inequities throughout Scarborough and strives to improve the quality of life and create a livable, prosperous Scarborough for all. SCAN works by identifying civic priorities through Scarborough-wide community engagement, and then at our annual summit, community members come together to co-create a plan to address the civic priorities identified by Scarborough residents. This forms SCAN's action mandate for the year, and it guides our work. Which brings us to this evening. SCAN is holding this event because public transit is without doubt one of Scarborough's top civic issues. From SCAN's community surveys over the past few years, Scarborough residents have consistently identified public transit as one of the top 3 priority issues. We're also holding this event tonight because public transit is vital for Scarborough communities from an equity standpoint. First, we know Scarborough is a vast region designed with the car in mind. Walking a major block in Scarborough is not typically a short, pleasant stroll, but rather more like an expedition. Owing to design and urban planning, public transit is an essential part of our community infrastructure. Second, we also have comparatively fewer opportunities for full-time, decent jobs with livable wages, and we have numerous underserved neighborhoods with high rates of poverty, often affecting immigrant and racialized communities. Public transit enables people to access work. It also enables people to get around in a relatively affordable way. The right to ride, the right to access public transit is a critical part of our socioeconomic fabric, not only individually, but also on a regional scale. If people cannot get around, then jobs cannot be filled, healthcare cannot be accessed, businesses cannot be frequented, vital community programs cannot be attended, and so on. And people can only get around if there's a network in place, if public transit is affordable, if there is reliable service, and if people feel safe and comfortable riding public transit. With the onset of COVID-19 and measures to flatten the curve, these essential parts of public transit are being threatened. We all know that before COVID-19, our public transit system was far from perfect. Affordability was and remains an issue for many Scarborough transit riders, owing to annual TTC fare increases over the past 10 years and inadequate transit equity measures. Reliable service has been an ongoing problem with the TTC. But in our new normal with the onset of COVID-19, we have seen the landscape of our public transit system dramatically altered. Today's event is designed to help us to make sense of the impact of COVID-19 on public transit for Scarborough and to equip us with what we need to do as concerned community members as we move to recovery and beyond to ensure our right to ride, which for Scarborough is a critical piece of our socioeconomic infrastructure. This is all the more urgent given the news today that Northeast Scarborough has been identified as one of the hot spots of the city with cases of COVID-19. But ultimately, it's what happens after this event that is most important, and that is to get you and other community members to act, to speak up, and to take 1 minute of our time to call or email our politicians to ensure we have safe, reliable, and affordable transit in place, one that meets the needs of ridership in Scarborough. Today's event will unfold as such. First, to speak to the big picture state of public transit and the impact of COVID-19, Sheila Pizey-Allen, the Executive Director of TTCriders, will start us off today to outline the situation with TTC funding, ridership, and service. Second, Following Sheila, Jamaal Myers of Scarborough Transit Action will speak to the impact of COVID-19 on public transit with a Scarborough-specific lens. Following Jamaal, Austin Jafri, longtime Scarborough resident and transit rider, will speak to specific lived realities of using the TTC in Scarborough during COVID-19 and provide a detailed on-the-ground picture of what riders have been experiencing. Finally, we will outline concrete action steps that we can take to support a functioning public transit system in Scarborough as we continue to live through this public health emergency and move to recovery. And we will do our best to reserve the last 15 minutes for questions and comments. And after the event, a right to ride toolkit will be emailed to you so you and others will be able to take action to support public transit. Okay, let me turn things over to Sheila.
Thanks so much, Anna, for organizing this important event. TTCriders is a membership-based organization of transit users, and we're really glad to be here tonight. We're doing this event because the TTC is facing a funding crisis. It's in big trouble. For those who missed it, last Friday, Mayor John Tory made an announcement that unless the TTC receives emergency funding from the provincial government in Ontario and from the federal government of Canada, the TTC will consider cutting service by 50%. And that means shutting down the Scarborough RT. It means shutting down the Shepherd subway. And it means waiting for your bus for 20 minutes instead of 10, 30 minutes instead of 15. But the TTC has actually already cut service during this pandemic. On May 10th, it cut service by 15%. And I know Austin and Jamaal are going to back to those cuts specifically in Scarborough. And I think we can all agree that cuts are totally unacceptable. Especially during a pandemic, they're causing safety issues as people are crowding onto buses. And here's a little bit about why we're in this situation today. Right now, riders pay for most of the cost of running TTC. So every time we get on a bus and we tap our Presto card and pay $3.20, that's not the full cost of a ride. The city puts in just over $1 in a subsidy, but riders pay the biggest share of the cost of running transit. But with fewer riders during the pandemic, that means less revenue for the TTC. But right now, we need to be running even more service so that riders are safe, so that they can be physically distanced on transit. And even if you are not taking public transit right now, you are relying on it. We're all depending on safe public transit because it is moving essential workers like nurses, personal support workers, people who work in grocery stores, and we will all need it in the future. So that's why we need you to take action with us. I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about the ridership impact. Before the pandemic, the TTC had about 1.7 million daily riders, but now ridership has fallen by 85%. And we know that the people riding transit right now are essential workers who are mostly racialized, they're mostly women, they're mostly earning lower incomes, working in low-wage jobs. And a recent survey by Matt Palm and Stephen Farber at the University of Toronto Scarborough found that 43% of people surveyed said that going to the grocery store is their most important trip. So it is essential workers, but it's people who must use the TTC to get food. And what we're hearing as TTC riders is that crowding has been happening throughout the pandemic. It's impossible to physically distance all the time. I want to shout out Sean Marshall, who made a really great map of where crowding, and most of the routes that are crowded are taking to essential jobs, are going through poor areas of Toronto and neighborhood improvement areas, taking people to warehouses and food service work like the infamous Fiera Foods factory. People are feeling crowded and they're worried about that. They're worried about their safety on transit. So just moving on to the next slide. And maybe even the next one. Here's some images of crowding that people have sent in to us, and we encourage you to document what's happening on transit and share it with us. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the changes that TTC has made in case you're not aware. And I would just encourage you to always go to ttc.ca, the TTC's website, to check out the latest changes because things have changed a lot and sometimes they've changed quite quickly. So you might watch this tomorrow, maybe already changed, who knows? So go to ttc.ca for the latest. But Some of what you'll see on the TTC right now is that seats have been blocked off for physical distancing. And the TTC has implemented rear door boarding to limit physical interaction between transit users and drivers. So the TTC is not accepting cash, tokens, or tickets on buses, on wheel trams, or sedan taxis. If you don't have Presto, the TTC is asking that you pay at the nearest station, but many people in Scarborough are taking the bus only, and it really raises a bigger question for us about access to Presto in general, right? It's not just during this pandemic. There are very few places to purchase Presto tickets and cards in Scarborough. Right now, TTC fare inspectors are only conducting education. They are not writing tickets or inspecting your fares. That is what officially they are supposed to be doing. Some people have been concerned about cleaning. The subway stations have had hand sanitizer installed, and the TTC is disinfecting vehicles twice a day on different touch points. And something that's new is that the TTC and the provincial government are strongly recommending that people wear face coverings on public transit. It's important to know that can mean like just any kind of cloth face covering, a scarf, a bandana. It doesn't have to be a special mask. And again, we would just recommend you go to ttc.ca in case that changes. Right now, masks are free. And if they were, of course, I think that would raise some issues around access, around enforcement, but right now they are being strongly recommended. So that's a little bit about the recent changes, and just want to start wrapping up by going on to the next slide and talking about what we need. So right now, there is absolutely zero funding coming from federal and provincial governments for transit operations. Nothing has been committed, and that really needs to change for us to have safe transit now and make sure that we can keep transit moving in the future in the way that we need. So what TTCriders and many other organizations across Canada are calling for is emergency funding from federal and provincial governments and permanent transit funding to keep the TTC running after the pandemic. That's the only way that we're going to be able to ensure that we have enough service and that transit is made more affordable. We also need more buses and streetcars, but that takes a while to implement. And then just to sum up, maybe moving on to the very last slide, the TTC is facing a crisis, and we all need to act now to make sure that transit is preserved in the future and that we get better transit, more affordable fares, and more frequent service. Because the huge service cuts that are being threatened if we don't get the emergency funding will put riders in unsafe and crowded conditions. So there's just a few ways here to take action. We'll be talking about them throughout this event. But the first thing you can do, it takes about 30 seconds, is just to go to sign the petition at keeptransitmoving.ca. And I'll wrap up there and just want to remind you, you can leave comments in the chat, and at the end of the next two presentations, we'll return to the questions and respond to them. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sheila. And now I'm going to turn things over to Jamaal Myers of Scarborough Transit Action, who's going to speak to the impact on public transit with a Scarborough-specific lens. Jamaal, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Hi, my name is Jamaal Myers, and I'm an organizer with Scarborough Transit Action, and we're a grassroots transit advocacy organization that advocates for Scarborough's transit riders. I've been with STA since 2018, and what I'd like to spend my time doing is trying to give you a sense of the transit situation in Scarborough. Next slide. So as anyone who's ever taken transit in Scarborough knows, getting around by TTC is frustrating and exhausting. A big reason for this is that access to the TTC in Scarborough, you need to use the bus in order to get where you're going. So as you can see from the chart up on the screen, 5 of the 13 busiest bus routes in Toronto are in Scarborough. So it's important to remember that when it comes to transit in Scarborough, buses are key as they allow the majority of area transit users to get to either a subway or an RT stop or to their final destination. Next slide. So partially due to our reliance on buses, most of Scarborough is considered a quote transit desert, which are defined as urban areas full of transit dependent people who are usually city residents that are lower income, elderly, disabled, or all of the above, and whom lack adequate access to transit services. What makes our deserts even worse than Scarborough is the spread out nature of our neighborhoods. And even in the areas where the bus stops are less spread out, i.e. located within 500 meters of one another, they can still be considered transit deserts if the stops are in areas that are designed for cars and pedestrians are forced to cross busy roads and avenues in order to reach them. Next slide. So why is this important to know? Well, as a result of the planned service cuts that Shelagh had mentioned in her presentation, Scarborough transit users will face longer wait times for buses and the elimination of certain bus routes altogether. This matters for two big reasons here in Scarborough. First, Scarborough transit users already have the longest commutes in the city. Just to give you a sense of my own commute, it's an hour and a half each way. I live at 401 in Nielsen and I work downtown. So that's 3 hours out of my day right there just getting to work. For different people, there are many different reasons for why their commutes are long, whether we're depending on buses, people don't own cars, walking isn't a reasonable option, so you can't walk to a rapid transit stop, you have to take a bus to a transit stop, and you don't have the option of riding your bike to a transit stop because it's just unsafe. As we all know, longer commute times affect your ability to run errands, to get to work, to access certain amenities throughout the city, or even to access childcare. Next slide. So the second reason these cuts matter is that it will make social distance even harder for commuters. So while the number of riders has dropped, as Shelagh mentioned previously, the number of buses that you need to move those riders hasn't dropped at all. So a bus is now considered full when 15 people are on it, whereas before COVID-19, a bus was considered full when 50 people were on it. So this heat map shows routes with more than 15 passengers waiting at stops. So the red indicates an emerging hotspot, whereas a yellow is a known hotspot. So I've listed the bus routes out to the left that are most affected by these hotspots. And as you can see, there's some pretty popular routes, whether it's along Markham, Eglinton East, or Shepherd. And as you probably, you don't need me to tell you this, but as you can guess, if the city does go ahead with its planned cuts, i.e. cutting down shutting off the Scarborough RT and shutting down the Shepherd line, you're likely to see a lot more red and yellow on this map, which is going to put both riders and employees at greater risk. Next slide. So now I'd like to start thinking about, so what comes after? We've sort of gotten into we've sort of passed the initial crisis phase of COVID-19. So just discussing, so we're 3 months into the pandemic and the conversation you can probably tell has shifted to what comes next for transit and transportation in Toronto. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen pictures of the city's new active TO program, which closes certain roads off to cars in order to allow pedestrians and cyclists more room to physically distance. If you live downtown, the program's great. However, if you look at this map, you immediately notice that the majority of them, like all of the major roads, not the majority, all of the major roads in Scarborough are unaffected. And the roads that are affected aren't connected to one another. So I live on one of those roads and there is no reason to shut this route down. So it's more seen as a leisurely option rather than a legitimate transportation use. So unless people feel safe biking in Scarborough, biking is unlikely to become a plausible option in the post-COVID era, especially taking a bike in order to access rapid transit. So this is important because, as you may not know, 1/3 of pedestrians killed in Toronto every year are from Scarborough. Next slide. Another thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that the TTC's COVID communications are almost all in English. So in a city like Toronto, and especially in Scarborough, this just isn't acceptable. Other cities like New York City see the importance of having COVID transit communications in multiple language. And this would be something very easy for the TTC to fix for the next time. Next slide. So I'm sure some of you know, currently Ontario government plans to build a 3-stop subway to replace the Scarborough RT. with stops at Lawrence East, Scarborough Town Centre, and the Shepherd and McCowan. It would cost between $5.5 to $6 billion and take 10 years to build. However, since ridership will be significantly down for the foreseeable future, while people have legitimate concerns over crowding on buses, it's fair to ask, does this plan still make sense? So for roughly the same amount of money, we could build a 50-stop LRT network made up of Scarborough, Eglinton East, and Shepherd East LRT that would give more people a quote right to ride. So STA has always supported the LRT option because it could be built faster and cheaper than a subway. More people could walk to a subway, a rapid transit stop, because there would be more stops and they'd be more geographically spread throughout the city. It allows for simultaneous streetscaping improvements like bike lanes. Also, the 50-stop LRT network services 7 priority neighborhoods, and those are those neighborhoods on the right that are shaded in yellow, and 3 post-secondary campuses, so 2 Centennial Colleges campuses and UTSC, whereas the subway only services 1 priority neighborhood. All of these issues are important that we consider. All of these issues were important before COVID-19, and they're just even more important now because of just the consequences of what happens when you have a transit system like we do, where people aren't allowed to physically distance. Final slide. So I just wanted to conclude by emphasizing how important it is to take action, both at an organizational and individual level. So just to give you an idea of, Sheila mentioned some great ideas that you can do as an individual. There's lots of other things you can do as an organization as well. So just to give you an example of some of the steps we've taken, we recently worked with TTCriders, SCAN, Connect Shepherd East, which is an organization working to build a Shepherd East LRT, and 42 Voices, which is a neighborhood organization based in Malvern. And we actually wrote a complaint to the Auditor General of Ontario asking that they force the province to conduct a full value for money audit of the Scarborough subway, because it didn't go through that kind of audit before it was approved by Metrolinx in violations of Metrolinx's own rules. So whether the letter is successful or not, it doesn't really matter. What's important is that people know that Scarborough and Scarborough voters are paying attention, and that we want accountability and transparency in how our transit decisions are made. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful, Jamaal. That's a really good, very good big picture overview of all the many challenges that we face with transit here in Scarborough. Okay, now I'm going to turn things over to Austin Jafri, who's going to talk about what people are actually experiencing on the TTC. And we know that, there are so many different experiences that we need to hear about in order to be able to address all the challenges that we have. So I'll hand things over to you, Austin.
Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Austin Jafri. I've lived in Scarborough my entire life. I was born in Scarborough. I've lived here my entire life. I always used transit because my family could not afford a car. So I'm going to get into some of the details of what's going on. And due to sake of time, I actually have to take out some of my examples because otherwise I'd be just talking for so long. So let's get rolling into the next slide. Cool. So I don't even have to say it. We know the Scarborough RT mess, like just mess, that's the word. This is my favorite line from the TTC. Delays of up to 15 minutes due to mechanical issues on line 3 SRT, which often turns into waiting an hour for a shuttle bus to come if it comes. So what happens is that riders are left stranded, and this SRT, it will shut down even in good weather. It doesn't even have to be winter. We know that the SRT is outdated and needs to be replaced. So what happens is it leaves riders stranded, and I call this the trickle-down effect. So in the next slide, I'll show you an example. Let's look over here. So over here, I have a screenshot, and now I use this website called transc.ca, where it actually tracks the live buses and compares it to the scheduled version of the buses. So buses pulled from routes. Vehicle, read it with me, vehicle 9089 Arctic articulated buses on route 134 near Warden Station heading south. This is evidence right here that that bus, route 134 Progress, goes between Scarborough Centre and Centennial College. So that bus is near Warden Station, nowhere near Scarborough Town Center. That bus is currently redeployed to be a Line 2 shuttle bus. What does that mean? That means that the bus is not going to show up when it's scheduled to show up on the 134. Longer wait for the next bus. The regular 134A to Malvern runs every 22 minutes, and it means more crowds. Next slide. So here's an example, another example, 134C Progress to Centennial College. If you look at my screenshot, it says scheduled at 11:51 a.m. Vehicle 9090 Arctic at Pape Avenue on Danforth Avenue. So what this means, again, this is proof that that bus was pulled from its route 134 Progress to be a Line 2 shuttle at Pape and Danforth Pape Station. So it's scheduled for 11:51 a.m., but it's not actually going to show up. That's another example. So whenever a subway shutdown happens and it's not planned, TTC pulls from its surface routes and it pulls buses. And what happens? Actually, I'll give you a quick example with the RT. Last year in January 2019, when we had that big storm, the RT was shut down, and at 11 o'clock at night at Lawrence East Station, I got on the shuttle bus. It was supposed to be going towards McCowan Station. Now I got on the bus, it was packed. The bus driver made a left turn on Kennedy Road and he went south, so opposite of going to Scarborough Town Center. And I approached the bus driver and I said, hey, like, aren't you supposed to go towards Scarborough Town Center? He said, yeah. He admitted to me that he did not know where he was going because the TTC pulled him off of his Route 42 comer and told him to become a shuttle. So he had to drop off his passengers at Bayview and Comer and come to Scarborough to be a shuttle. And he tried calling the TTC and they weren't picking up. So he had no idea where he was going. I actually had to direct the driver and direct him back to STC and to stop along the stations on the way. And he told me his friend who was driving 63 Ossington, now that's in the West End, got pulled to be a Line 3 shuttle bus as well. And these operators are unfamiliar with Scarborough routes. So that's another issue. What if I wasn't on that bus that night? Who knows what would happen? Next slide. So I want to talk about some poor planning on behalf of the TTC. Let's look at this route over here. So I've pulled a screenshot of two buses on the 913 Progress Express. If you look at number 1, it is cutting behind Progress Avenue. Number 2 is following the by the book routing that the TTC has given them. So this route is called Progress Express. And the way the TTC made it was for the bus to turn off of Progress Avenue, go up Corporate Drive, turn again on Concilium Place, just to re-intersect back with Progress Avenue. That doesn't make any sense. So I've told the TTC to change the route to make it cut through Progress Avenue as number 1 is doing. And that will save a few minutes each trip because there are a couple stops by the condominiums that the bus is not going to stop at. What's the point of making it go on Corporate Drive? Some operators do use the shortcuts, which is technically going off route, and other operators just follow by the book. So it's definitely confusion and frustration for passengers and added travel time that shouldn't really be there. So next slide. So when TTC talks about service changes, every 6 weeks, TTC does something called service changes, service improvements. And this term is called route resiliency. What this means is that they are not, make no mistake, they are not adding extra buses onto your route. They're actually adjusting the schedules and giving the buses more time in between them to get from point A to point B. For example, if your bus used to come every 12 minutes, the service improvement would mean that your bus comes every 15 minutes because they've added an extra 3 minutes. They've added extra time to the route for it to get to the end due to traffic. So they just widen the schedule time. They're not adding buses to address crowding. And again, this is a funding issue because they do not have the funding to do so. So to see specific routes, I refer you to stevemonroe.ca. He's amazing. And he has an article called When Better Service Isn't Part 1 Scarborough. I urge you to check that out. Next slide. So I've talked a bit about Scarborough transit problems pre-COVID. Let's delve into what's happening now. Next slide. All right, 54 Lawrence East. I'm sure everyone in Scarborough has heard of this route. Multiple drop-off only buses during the day. Last week, I had to wait at Bellamy and Lawrence for 2 buses to pass by me before I could even get on one. In fact, last Thursday, I was on the 54 Lawrence East, and at Kennedy and Lawrence, there were 24 people on my bus at 3:45 p.m. I actually took that picture that's in the slide right there. That is not social distancing. So, and I also want to bring up, I'm going to talk a bit about this, the neighborhood improvement areas. So I've linked the map that the City of Toronto has published in 2018 of the emerging neighborhood and neighborhood improvement areas, AKA marginalized folks, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and lower income folks. That route serves one of those areas, and it also stops directly in front of a general hospital. So why don't we have enough buses on the 54? Next slide. Awesome. I want to talk about York Mills. Okay, so York Mills, 95A and 995. Before COVID-19, TTC used to run the 995 York Mills Express. As you know, the Express network is suspended, and I will talk a bit about that more after. So before COVID, during the day on weekdays, the 995 ran every 15 minutes, the 95A ran every 20 minutes. But now there's no 995 anymore. So that means that there's only the 95A that goes east of Kennedy Road. So between Kennedy Road, Kennedy and Ellesmere and Kingston Road, the bus only comes every 20 minutes. And we know that Ellesmere Road is a busy road. It also goes through two of the neighborhoods, Dorset Park and Woburn and Mornell Court. So lots of riders ride this bus, but it's coming every 20 minutes during the day because there's no more York Mills Express. Again, more crowds, drop off only, frustrated riders. Next slide. Steele's Express, so Express Network, they've canceled the Express Network, but it's suspended. I added question marks because I've seen 939A and 939B Finch Express buses running at Scarborough Town Center. Now this is confusing because the operators were told to run locally and stop at every stop, but you cannot track any of the express buses on your TTC apps because it's suspended, but they're still running certain express buses and you can't track them. You don't know when they're going to come. So there's no consistency. That's confusion for riders. It's not consistent messaging. And I want to talk about 953 Steele's East Express. So this route, the express portion used to provide service to the Morningside Heights area, which is Nielsen Road, Staines Road, Staines, McNichol, Morningside area. And with the cut to the express network, there is no scheduled service going to Morningside Heights now. What TTC does now is something called, and they've done this before COVID, but more so now, they have a pool of buses. And in this pool of buses, I'm talking about the run as directed, the RAD buses operated to fill in. TTC has a pool of buses that they assign to routes they deem is worthy of having extra service and needs extra service. The problem with these run as directed buses is that there's no consistency. When will my bus arrive? The bus will just show up randomly. There's no way of me tracking the bus on any app. There's no way I can plan my trip because I don't know when the run as directed bus is going to come. Who knows if they could decide to put a run as directed bus on that route that day. So can we trust that the run as directed buses are enough service? I argue they should have just kept the 953 Steele's Express during rush hour and kept the service consistent going to Morningside Heights, but that is not the case due to the COVID cuts. Next slide. So now I want to talk more about mandatory masks on transit. So we all know in Scarborough, this is not like downtown. We cannot just, there's not a Rabba Fine Foods or a Shoppers Drug Mart or a Rexall or a convenience store just down the road like there are downtown. There's so many of them. In Scarborough, as we know, and as Jamaal spoke about earlier, we often have to, if you don't have a car, you need to take a bus to get places. If I lived at Morningside Heights, I would either have to take a Steele's bus to go to Markham and Steele's to go to a Walmart, or I would have to take the Nielsen 133 out to Malvern Mall. It's not really walkable. So a lot of places in Scarborough, you need, if you don't have a car, you need transit. And as we know, the transit is not enough, especially with the cuts. So making masks mandatory on transit, it's actually an equity issue. You cannot force people to wear masks, and I'll tell you why. Price gouging. We know that that's an issue. Unavailable at stores. I've been to Dollarama, Walmart, Shoppers Drug Mart, and I have not seen any masks. And we also have to think about low-income riders. We also need to kind of check our own privilege and think about the other people who ride the TTC. And I'm talking about these marginalized, racialized people that I've mentioned who often live in the emerging neighborhoods and the neighborhood improvement areas as the City of Toronto maps them out. I'm talking about riders who may not have disposable income to buy masks. What if they have asthma, such as myself? What if they're autistic? What if they have certain health barriers that they cannot wear a mask? So, and logistically, if you want to come at me with the argument that we should hand out masks to all riders, I mean, that would be amazing, but logistically, it's impossible to make sure every single person on the TTC has a mask. So I argue that we cannot deny riders if they fail to meet such requirements. As I say with education, education is for all. TTC is a public service for all walks of life. Next slide. And yeah, so here we have photos of the masks, and I just want to emphasize masks, good practice, yes, encourage them, but do not force, and do not shame anybody on TTC if they do not have a mask, because you have to remember the equity issue behind is health and barriers, and I'm talking about socioeconomical barriers to get a mask. Next slide. So I just want to end with some concluding remarks on my part. I know I've got a bit technical about the runners directed and the express network being canceled and all my different examples with the bus routes. And feel free to chat with me if you want some more. I love talking about this stuff. So we are essential workers. All of a sudden now we have this pandemic, and now everyone is hyping up these workers. They're saying, hey, you know, those grocery store workers, those factory workers, those personal support workers, they're our heroes. Yeah. But why weren't, like, I'm sitting here like, why weren't we saying this before the pandemic? It took a pandemic for us to realize that. These essential workers, they are racialized folks. They are paid poorly. And this is a fact. Many are financially vulnerable, and thus they rely on transit. And cutting transit puts our so-called heroes that we're praising and that all the politicians are praising all of a sudden, even though, you know, they didn't want to pay them a decent wage all these years. They're praising them, but they're cutting transit. Cutting transit puts them more at risk. It also puts any rider at risk because you cannot social distance in a 54 Lawrence East bus packed with 24 people in it. Yeah, so what I suggest to you is start a conversation with a friend. Start a conversation about this stuff. Talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, talk to your family members. Join our campaign, which we'll talk about in a second, and elect progressive pro-transit politicians. And one thing I just wanted to add quick, because it just came to my mind, 57 Midland was also another route that was cut. I'm looking out the window and I've seen constant drop-off only buses too. So 57 Midland, when I went on a walk the other day, I saw the 116 Morningside. As we know, 116 Morningside, it actually serves, I think, 4 neighborhood improvement areas. It serves Eglinton East, it serves Malvern, it serves Scarborough Village, and it serves Mornell Court and Morningside. When I went on my walk, I noticed 3 116 Morningside buses in the span of 20 minutes, and all of them were drop-off only. They were all packed. So that to me is unacceptable. There needs to be adequate service on the routes that desperately need it. And so no cuts to TTC, more funding now. That's what I have to say. If there's anything you took away from me, more funding now. And now Anna's going to talk more about our campaign, Anna and Sheila.
Okay, great. So well done. Thank you, Austin. Thank you. And thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Jamaal. If you can all come back up, that'd be great. Yeah, that sort of captures it in a nutshell, you know, and I think everyone can relate to transit woes in Scarborough and all the things that you talk about. And it's also really good to get a sense of what's really happening. You know, if people are taking the buses right now, what they're living through and kind of what the future looks like if we don't have funding in place. That said, we know, thanks to Sheila, Jamaal, and Austin, we know the issues that we're facing with public transit, and there are many, and we need to act to ensure Scarborough communities can access public transit safely, affordably, and reliably. So now it's time for us to speak up and take civic action. And as Austin said, this means letting our politicians, our decision makers know that we need a safe, reliable, robust, affordable transit system, and it's essential for the well-being of our communities. So one key action that we can all do across Scarborough, and you don't have to be a transit rider, it can be to support our community members, and that is to let our politicians know that we care about public transit and the communities that public transit serves. And remember, we all benefit from a functioning, decent, and safe public transit system. And we can do this simply by calling our federal and provincial elected representatives. After this event, as I told you earlier, we will send you a toolkit by email, which contains phone numbers and email addresses for our politicians. And you can call during regular business hours, or you can call in the evening and simply leave a message. You can call and leave 3 simple things in your message. 1, your name. 2, your riding or your nearest intersection. And 3, just let your politicians know that you care about public transit. You care about a functioning, safe, reliable public transit system that's going to serve the needs of Scarborough transit riders. You can read from a script. We're going to send you some samples in our toolkit, and it takes less than a minute. And to demonstrate just how easy it is, I'm going to call on Austin, who has a lot of expertise in this. Do you want to give us a sample run, Austin?
Awesome, yeah. All right.
Okay.
So I'm going to call my politician. Good morning. How are you doing? I'm great, thanks. So my name is Austin Jafri, and I live in your riding. And I want to let you know that I support fully funded public transit. I'm a transit user, and I've been noticing that the buses are crowded, and there is no way for us to have social distancing in these buses. Please urge everyone to fund public transit properly. We need a safe, reliable transit system. Awesome. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Bye.
Oh, wonderful. Done like a pro. Excellent. Okay. And you can see just how easy it was. It just takes less than a minute. And if you have a script, it'll just help you along. It's as simple as that. Or you can send an email, and we're going to send you an email template that you can use, which would be very similar to what Austin has conveyed, just simply letting politicians know that you care and that you're concerned that we don't have enough funding in place to support our bus network, to support physical distancing measures, and to ensure that our transit riders feel secure and safe. Sorry, one more thing. After you've called your representative, I encourage you to inform other community members, as Austin said, reach out to your neighbors, reach out to your colleagues, other people that you work with, and call on them to contact their representatives and let them know that they care about transit as well. Because the more politicians hear from, the stronger the message, and then the higher the likelihood of our government actually doing something. And I would encourage you to keep the phone call friendly, as Austin did, and civil. And there's no need to be argumentative. You're just simply there to share what you think is important. Before we move on, Shelagh, Jamaal, do you have any other tips to add in terms of phone calls?
Go ahead.
Go. No.
Just to really impress upon the need for emergency funding. Without emergency funding now from the provincial and federal governments, the TTC will face even further service cuts. That's a safety issue for everyone riding transit, but it's also about the future of our transit system. So, it's a really urgent issue, and use that emergency transit funding. Hopefully you can, after you watch this, once you get the toolkit, you can make a call today or tomorrow. Call as soon as possible, because we could be seeing cuts very, very soon if we the emergency transit funding.
Yeah, that's definitely, I want to add, that's a key word. So even if you just want to write that down, emergency transit funding now. That's great, Shelagh.
Okay. And that would be, those cuts that you're talking about would be in addition to the cuts that were just made.
That's right. So the TTC has already 15% service cuts, and the mayor has said that without emergency funding, it could be forced to cut service by 50%, shut down the Scarborough RT and the Shepherd subway.
Okay. Jamaal, did you want to add something to that before we move on to the next?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with adding a line along the lines of, I will be voting based on transit in the next election. Just to make it very clear that this isn't just that you're very serious about that. Nothing gets a politician's attention like a voter, like someone who's determined to vote.
Okay, good tip. Thank you. Okay, The next simple thing that you can do immediately, right after you leave this webinar, is that you can sign a petition, or you can sign a letter to show your support for public transit. We're going to include links to these in the toolkit. Obviously, right now, it's not very easy to collect signatures from people directly, and everything has moved online. So it'd be really good if you could share these links with your networks after you've signed. And I'm wondering, Sheila, if you could briefly explain how this works for people who've never done this before.
Totally. I posted a link on Facebook, and you'll get it in the toolkit as well. But when you go to keeptransitmoving.ca, you can send a message to your MPP, your MP, to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and to Premier Ford in just one click. You'll fill out your name, your email, and your postal code, and click send, and it will go right to those politicians. So it's super easy. It takes about 30 seconds, and you just need to go to keeptransitmoving.ca.
So I just need my name, my postal code,
And your
my
email address.
Right. Okay. And that's it.
That's
Excellent.
it.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay. Another thing you could do as well is if you are with a group or an organization, you may also want to send a letter on behalf of your group too. So not only individually signing, but also letting our politicians know that your group is concerned. Okay. Our third action is you can also volunteer with a transit advocacy group or campaign. Some great advocacy groups would be TTCriders and Scarborough Transit Action. I know that TTCriders is holding phone banking sessions. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're trying to encourage our supporters and members to make calls to their MPs. So we are inviting volunteers to sign up on our website. It'll be in your toolkit, and I'll make sure to post a link right now. And we'll train you and make sure you know exactly what to say. And you'll be calling people and then connecting them directly with their MP to leave a message.
Wonderful. Okay. Right. Okay. And finally, of course, you can use social media to let politicians know that you care about the TTC and want to ensure Scarborough communities are able to access safe, affordable, and reliable transit. And again, more information will be included in the toolkit that we'll be sending out shortly after we wrap up here. So those are the four main things that we can do. Very simple, very easy to do. And I encourage you to call your politicians, to email them, and to talk to your neighbors, to your fellow community members too. Okay, so I think we're kind of on time here. We can move to questions and comments. Sheila, are we seeing some questions and comments? I know we've had some technical difficulties and we had to switch to Facebook. And so it might be, and I apologize for that, but we're, yeah, you know, life happens, but here we are. And we will be sending out a link to the recording after. So if you got on late, or if you wanted to revisit some of what you've heard today, you will be able to do that. Okay. So any questions or comments that you're seeing?
I've just seen there's a question about Wheel-Trans cuts. And I just wanted to return to some of what Austin was saying about masks, because I just want to make it really clear that, and as somebody made a comment about masks as well, that the TTC right now is not actually making masks mandatory. They are strongly recommending face covering. So that's just, I think, important to know that you can wear a scarf, you can wear a bandana. Masks are not mandatory right now, but the TTC is strongly recommending that everyone wear a face covering to protect everybody else around you and on the bus. So I wanted to mention that. And then around Wheel-Trans cuts, yes, cuts to Wheel-Trans are part of the threatened cuts if there is no emergency transit funding. And you know, I can maybe follow up and ask some people who are part of the accessibility committee of TTCriders to speak more about some of their experiences on Wheel-Trans and follow up on that comment online after too. I don't know if Jamaal or Austin, that's the only comment I see now, but what we can do too is go back and respond to comments online after, if anybody wants to leave one as a digital comment after we're wrapped.
And if you have any questions about technical details, like, you know, certain routes in Scarborough, maybe if I know, I'll be able to answer those and connect you with some resources to certain routes. because due to sake of time, I only used a couple examples of different routes in Scarborough, but if you have a specific question, feel free to ask and I can definitely point you to the correct resource.
So I'll throw in a few random questions because there's a bit of time, and I know there was a lot of discussion through, I know Ben Spur did like a big chat today on the Toronto Star's site, a lot of different questions about like fares, for instance. So Shelagh, I wonder if you could just remind us, like, what is the policy with payment, and how is that being monitored, or is it, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so first of all, so if you're taking a bus, you are being asked to board through the rear doors. So you're not supposed to pay with cash, tokens, or tickets. And that's because you'd be coming into really close contact with the driver, you'd be changing hands potentially. But of course, not everybody has Presto or access to Presto, especially in Scarborough and other neighborhoods where there isn't a subway station, there isn't a Shoppers Drug Mart to purchase Presto tickets or cards. So the TTC has said that they are asking people to pay when they get to the nearest station. You may not be going to a station, especially if you're commuting within Scarborough by bus. It's a little bit different for streetcars and subways. So you are asked to pay with Presto to access the subway. Same with the streetcar. But fare inspectors are not supposed to be doing inspection right now. That is the official policy, and it's because it is unsafe. It would be coming into close physical contact with lots of people, handling their personal materials. So the TTC has officially suspended fare inspection right now. But that doesn't mean that people aren't having negative experiences, and we would be really interested to know if that's happened to you, what's happening, and what people are experiencing.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, but I missed the chat, so I don't know.
Okay, and in terms of enforcing physical distancing on buses, I mean, like we've seen like the photo there that we have up on the screen, and Austin too has been speaking of, you know, people being crowded on buses, which, I mean, how can they reasonably enforce physical distancing on buses as we go forward? Are there any real measures that can be taken?
Well, right now, maybe also, you know, I know you have some thoughts around this too, but right now some buses will switch to being drop off only. So if they hit that limit on the bus, they may drive right past you, and that's just because it's not safe for you to get on because the bus is too crowded. But as more and more people start to take transit, it's going to become much more difficult for people who are stuck waiting at the stop and waiting to get to work. And that's exactly why we need funding to make sure that we can run as much service as possible on the TTC for safe social distancing. One other piece I would just mention is that, yeah, right now the TTC is about 15% ridership. Once it reaches about 30% of the normal ridership, the TTC will need to run 100% of the service to maintain social distancing. That's why we need to fight back against these cuts. But at a certain point, you know, what happens when we do get to 100% capacity? One possible quick fix could be bus lanes so that buses move faster. People are on the bus for a shorter amount of time. But there will be a point where there are some questions about how to manage when more people return to transit.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Sheila, that I've been noticing just going on a walk every day and like going to do groceries and stuff and using the TTC, that I've noticed the buses are actually getting busier now that it's warmer than in March. Like I know TTC said the statistic is 15%, but when I actually look on the buses, to me, it seems that TTC is a lot more busy now. I think to enforce social distancing, certain operators are enforcing drop-off only, and certain operators aren't. Like that bus I was on, he let 24 people come on the bus, and that was it. But it's also hard for the operator to do that because they can't talk or contact anybody. And I've noticed the 21C Brimley, for example, 3 people got on at Brimley and Lawrence the other day, and the bus seemed like it could have carried a few more people, but the operator instantly, when she saw a crowd of 3 people get on, she changed it to drop off only. Okay. So it really is up to the operator's discretion, and I guess in this case it's a luck. I feel like it's a losing battle because either you get on a bus that's too busy and pose your risk to your health, or you wait for another bus, and then who knows if you'll be able to get on that bus. So it's really up to the operator.
Yeah, and I mean, they have to drive the bus too.
Yeah.
So I think it's putting a lot of pressure on operators to make decisions when it really needs to be about the service level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead,
like
Austin.
you're saying, it depends on the route and so on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if the SRT does, I mean, what is the likelihood of that happening? The SRT being shut down along with the Shepherd subway? I mean, at this point, Sheila, what are you seeing?
I think that the mayor outlined potential cuts to show exactly how serious it is and how desperately the TTC needs support from the provincial and federal governments. I think we all know that those cuts are just not an option. The reality is without funding, the TTC has budgeted to use, its budget is built around using user fees to pay for the budget. Of course, the city does have other options to raise revenue, but the province and the federal government really do need to come to the table. They can't abandon transit. This is happening not just in Toronto, but in other cities all across Canada are cutting service. Some cities have canceled service completely. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about that.
I just want to say, I think this is the problem because TTC is so funded on people's fares. It's too reliant on the fare box, I would argue. And I think that's kind of why we got here to this point where we're so reliant on the fare box instead of funding from the government. So that's why we're in this sticky situation. And I would like to say too that we cannot go back. Like even when COVID is over, a lot of places as they're reopening in this phase 1 are enforcing social distancing. So we cannot go back to pre-COVID. The new normal cannot be shoving in as many people as you can and packing a bus like a sardine can. It can't go back to that even down the line when this pandemic is over. So we need funding now, but also for transit in the future.
So maybe it's an opportunity then to sort of right something that was clearly very problematic to start with, right? And increase.
That we normalized.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So
Yeah.
maybe this is, the time. I mean, I know in other circumstances, people are talking about, using or leveraging this time to, make things right or make things more equitable. And I think maybe that's the same with transit. Okay, I'm looking at the clock. I'm going to start wrapping up, but if there's any additional comments that you'd like to make, here's your chance.
I'd just like to make one quick comment about the SRT. So regardless of whether the city shuts it down or not, the SRT is past its lifespan. So at some point, the SRT will be shut down and will be replaced by a shuttle bus service. Mm-hmm. Until either it is replaced by an LRT or a subway. If we go the subway route, we could be looking at almost 10 years of not having an SRT route. So I think we should really consider that when we look at planning the next steps of transit in Scarborough.
So maybe time for a transit reset, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so there you have it, an overview of the state of public transit and the impact of COVID-19 on Scarborough transit users. I want to thank our guest speakers, Shelagh Pizey-Allen from TTCriders, Jamaal Myers from Scarborough Transit Action, and Austin Jafri, Scarborough transit rider and activist, for taking the time to inform us about what's at stake for Scarborough and the lived realities of Scarborough transit users as we continue to navigate the COVID-19 public health emergency and look to recovery. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to become informed about the issues and to learn about what you can do to act. And now the torch has been passed to you, and it's critical that we all act now. I urge you to call our Scarborough MPs and MPPs and ask for intergovernmental cooperation to ensure that the TTC is adequately funded so we can have a safe, decent, reliable, and affordable public transit network and ensure that we have the right to ride. And we know that that right is essential in Scarborough. So all of you who've registered for this event, you will receive an action toolkit by email shortly after we wrap up. I encourage you to take 1 minute and contact your politicians. Do it tonight, do it tomorrow, do it this week. Put it on your list of priorities and share the word, and also call on others to call. I want to thank you again. Stay safe and have a good evening.
Anna, I just
Thank
wanted
you,
to
Anna.
thank you, Anna. I wanted to just quickly mention something.
Okay.
It just seems like we skipped one question. I actually wanted to ask, how do we actually persuade some of the downtown progressive councillors to pay attention to the needs of racialized Scarborough communities and transit? I think that was just a question.
Oh, whoops. I could have missed a few questions just from the this time sync kind of thing, but
okay, maybe we'll wrap up on that note. Austin, you wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if we have any tips for persuading some of these progressive downtown councillors to pay attention to the transit needs of Scarborough. As we know, like Jamaal, for example, is going downtown to his job from Scarborough and his commute is not the best. So if we can think of any tips to answer that question, we will put it in the comments when the live is over.
Okay.
I think Anna has answered already that, you know, we should join organizations and organize for change. Right. And Anna's sent us some amazing tools to use to take action on our own tonight and tomorrow. Okay. But yes, we can respond more.
I don't think I can fully respond to that, but I do want to say that I know there are a lot of Scarborough councillors from all over the city who are genuinely concerned about transit in Scarborough. So I don't want to speak for anybody, but I don't think that dichotomy is really accurate. But I do think it's really important that our politicians actually know what it's like to ride transit, to understand how vital it is for all communities. So I think that, you know, we need to push for everyone to have that awareness, and perhaps, yeah, to ride the TTC more regularly than perhaps they do, and to talk with folks like us to learn more about what needs to be done. Okay, so on that note, I think we're going to wrap up. Okay, thank you all again, and thank you all again. Now it's your turn to take action. Okay, have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thanks.